Have you ever imagined what would happen if a 70-year-old man decided to spend an entire night alone in an abandoned cemetery? Not just any cemetery, but one forgotten by time, full of broken tombstones, moss-covered graves, and stories no one dares tell. Now think, what if this man weren't completely alone? Beside him, only a war dog, trained to face danger, but still able to sense the fear that lingers in the air. It sounds like a scene from a movie, but what you're about to discover may surprise you. My name is John Miller. I live in Charleston, South Carolina, and since I was young, I've always sought extreme challenges. Hunting in the forest, trekking through mountains, nights of survival in inhospitable places. But nothing compares to the psychological toll of facing the darkness of an abandoned cemetery. At 70, many tell me I should be resting, but it's precisely at this age that I've decided to prove that the mind and spirit can still be stronger than the body. Have you ever experienced this? That feeling of needing to test yourself, that something inside you is asking for more, even when everyone around you tells you it's crazy. This challenge isn't about comfort. It's about facing silence, solitude, and the echoes of untold stories. Imagine walking among ancient tombstones, while the moon illuminates just enough to reveal shadows that seem to move on their own. With each step, the sound of dry leaves breaks the silence. But what truly sends shivers down your spine is when the war dog stops, stares into the darkness, and growls softly, as if seeing something you can't. Stay with me until the end, because this experience goes far beyond simply enduring the wee hours. The city of Charleston carries centuries of history, bloody battles, and mysteries hidden around every corner. Many say the cemeteries here are portals, places where the past insists on manifesting itself. And it was in one of these cemeteries that I decided to embark on a 24-hour test. It wasn't just about surviving the cold of the night or the hunger that tightened my stomach. It was about facing fear, the kind you can't see, but feel deep within. As I prepared my few supplies, a flashlight, a rope, a knife, and some water, I realized that every detail could mean the difference between holding out or giving up. My dog, my faithful companion, seemed even more restless than I was. He'd been to war zones, faced dangers many humans would never know. But there, before the cemetery's rusty gates, even he hesitated to enter. And it was at that moment that I knew the real battle wouldn't be against nature, but against the invisible. Who hasn't wondered how they would react in a situation like this? Being alone in a place steeped in legend, where the wind seems to whisper, and every shadow might hide something unknown. Some would call it madness. Others would call it courage. I simply call it necessity. The need to prove I can still do it. The need to feel life pulsing even in the midst of death. The need to find answers that may not even exist. Have you ever been in a place where every noise, no matter how small, seems like a sign that something is about to happen? Your heart races. Your mind creates images your eyes can't confirm. And suddenly time seems slower, as if the night will never end. It's in this state that survival ceases to be merely physical and becomes mental. And I guarantee the greatest enemies in an abandoned cemetery aren't ghosts, but your own thoughts. What happens in the next few hours may completely change the way you view courage, fear, and even the concept of survival. And when my war dog did something I never expected, I realized that night would be like no other in my life. But that's what you'll find out next. And as I tell you this story, I can't help but think about how every detail, every sensation, Every chill experienced that night becomes even more powerful when shared. So, I want to ask you something very simple, but one that makes all the difference. If this topic resonates with you, if at any point you felt fear take over or faced something that seemed impossible, leave here in the comments what has touched you most so far. It could be your opinion, your experience, or even that question that's been lingering in your head. I read every comment, and it's precisely this exchange that transforms a video into a true community of people who believe in the power of overcoming and survival. And since you're here with me on this journey, don't forget to leave a like. It may seem like a small gesture, but it helps keep this flame burning, showing that it's worth continuing to bring you intense stories, full of emotion and mystery. Your support strengthens this space and paves the way for more people to discover this type of content. If you feel like you're part of this adventure, if you want to continue following every step, every new challenge, every shadow that might hide something unexpected, subscribe to the channel. That way, you'll stay up to date and won't miss a single detail of the upcoming stories, which, I promise, will be even more intense. Your participation here is what makes this channel grow and reach more people who, like you, seek emotion, truth, and that dash of courage that moves life. And it was with that same courage that I moved forward that night, my heart racing, my breathing heavy, and my dog attentive to every noise that emerged in the darkness. You've heard me say that at 70, I decided to take on a challenge that seemed impossible to many. But before we dive headfirst into that night in the abandoned cemetery, it's important that you understand who I am, where I came from, and why I chose this extreme test. Because none of what happened next would make sense if I hadn't opened my heart to show the truth behind this journey. And perhaps by sharing this with you, I can touch something within your own story. My name is John Miller, and I was born and raised in Charleston, a city marked by the weight of history and the scars of war. I grew up on narrow streets surrounded by old mansions where the past is never far away. From an early age, I was taught to respect discipline, the hardships of life, and the need to always be prepared for the unexpected. My father served in the military, my grandfather fought in World War II, and I myself spent my years in conflict zones, where I understood that survival isn't just about physical endurance, but also about learning to deal with what the mind creates in the darkest hours. Perhaps that's why, even after so much time, I still carry within me this need to test myself. While many my age seek comfort, security, and tranquility, I find myself most alive precisely when faced with risk. Not because I'm not afraid. Quite the opposite. I feel fear in every part of my body, but I've learned that it is proof that I'm still alive. It was this thought that led me to accept the idea of spending an entire night inside an abandoned cemetery. I wanted to understand how far I could go, how far my mind would resist, and what kind of strength still resided within me. And I wasn't completely alone. My partner that night was a war dog, trained from puppyhood to survive in extreme conditions. He's strong, agile, and disciplined, but he's also an animal that senses what we humans often fail to perceive. They say dogs can smell fear, hear what human ears can't hear, and sense presences that can't be explained by logic alone. I knew having him with me would be both an advantage and a risk, because if he reacted to something I couldn't see, terror would be inevitable. And that was precisely the test I wanted to face. The choice of location wasn't random. Charleston is known for its historic cemeteries, many of them forgotten by time. There are places where the headstones date back to the 18th century, covered in moss and nearly swallowed by the earth. And it was in one of these places, isolated, away from the busy streets and without visitors for decades, that I decided to enter. The iron gate was rusted, partially fallen, and every step I took seemed to echo among the twisted trees surrounding the ground. There was no room for distractions there. It was just me, my dog, and a heavy silence, broken occasionally by the distant call of a crow, or the sound of the wind sweeping dry leaves across the ground. As I prepared for this challenge, many people asked me why. Why risk so much? Why put my body and mind under such enormous pressure? And the answer is simple. I needed to prove to myself that I still had control over my life. Old age is often seen as a burden, as a sign that the time to fight has passed. But I don't accept that idea. I believe that while I breathe, I can choose to face. I can choose to learn. I can choose to grow. That night in the cemetery was a symbol of all this. A confrontation with the ghosts outside, but especially with those within. The preparation wasn't just physical. Of course, I brought some basic supplies: a flashlight, a rope, a knife, water, and some food. But what really worried me was how to keep my mind steady in the face of the unknown. I spent days studying accounts of experiences in abandoned places, hearing stories of people who gave up in the face of absolute silence, or who swore they'd seen things they couldn't explain. Some would call these stories urban legends. Others would say they were just figments of imagination. But I knew that when darkness falls, and you're alone in a place steeped in history, the line between reality and imagination becomes increasingly blurred. And then there was the weight of the place itself. Charleston is known for carrying memories of war, slavery, and bloody battles that marked not only the city, but the entire country. Many of these cemeteries are considered haunted, and not by chance. They were the scene of pain, suffering, and violent deaths. The invisible walls of that place held stories that would never be told in books, but which seemed to scream in every broken stone, every crooked cross, every shadow cast by the moon. Entering there, I knew I would face not only the cold of the night, but also the emotional weight of centuries of suffering condensed into a single space. The dog seemed to sense this better than I did. Even before we crossed the gate, he was already restless. His eyes darted around, his ears pricked at every distant sound, and his body remained tense. I knew that behavior. It was the same one he displayed in combat zones, when he sensed danger before any soldier could confirm it. This was my first test, to maintain control, even when my own companions seemed to be telling me something was wrong. Many would say I could have chosen a simpler challenge, spending a night in a forest, in an abandoned cabin, on a deserted beach. But none of these scenarios would have the same psychological impact as a cemetery. There was no escaping the weight of symbolism. To be surrounded by tombstones was to be surrounded by the reminder of mortality. It was like staring one's own finitude in the face and saying, "I'm not finished yet." It was like conversing with death, and for one night, trying to defeat it. As I walked among the tombs in the fading light, I felt a mixture of adrenaline and calm. Strange to say, there was a quiet peace there, as if the outside world had disappeared. At the same time, my heart beat faster, anticipating what was to come. I knew the real test was yet to begin, that the night would bring with it not only darkness but questions I might not be ready to answer. But I stood there, determined, knowing that retreat was not an option. And perhaps that's why this story is so important to tell, because it's not just about me, nor just about surviving in an abandoned cemetery. It's about what happens when we decide to face our limits, when we accept fear's invitation and choose to walk toward it instead of running away. And by sharing this, I hope you too will think about your own limits, your own fears, and what you would do if you were in my position. That night was just beginning. The sun hadn't yet completely set, but darkness already stretched between the trees and graves. The air was colder, the wind stronger, and the silence heavier. The dog, firm at my side, seemed ready for anything, though his eyes told a different story. And I, with every muscle tensed, knew the real challenge was about to begin. Preparing for a night inside an abandoned cemetery doesn't begin the moment you walk through the rusty gate. It begins much earlier, days, perhaps weeks before, when the idea is still just a thought that insists on returning every time you close your eyes. I knew I couldn't simply enter that place without preparation. Survival, after so many years of experience, isn't just about being present at the scene. It's about anticipating scenarios, organizing strategies, and above all, preparing your mind for the unforeseeable. When I decided to take on this challenge, I sat at my small wooden table at home, next to old maps of the city of Charleston. Many of those cemeteries were built in times when records weren't organized like they are today, and much of what we know comes from oral histories, stories passed down from generation to generation, blending fact with legend. I carefully studied every detail I could find: where the cemetery was, which roads led to it, how many people had visited it in recent years, and most importantly, what kind of stories circulated about the place. Some spoke of figures walking among the tombstones. Others mentioned the sounds of chains dragging in the middle of the night. There were even those who claimed that certain tombs had been violated, not by thieves, but by forces that could not be explained. I couldn't rule anything out, because I knew that once inside, any noise, any shadow, would have power over my mind. Preparation also involved understanding the weight of these stories, absorbing each one, and still being willing to face reality. The next step was to organize what I would take with me. I've learned over time that too much can be as dangerous as too little. There was no point carrying a backpack full of gear if it would make me slower, more vulnerable, and more tired. I took only the essentials: a sturdy flashlight with fresh batteries, because the darkness would be my greatest enemy. A survival knife, not just for defense, but as a tool. A rope, because you never know when you'll need to improvise a shelter or escape an obstacle. Enough water for the night, some energy bars, and dried fruit, because the body needs fuel even when the mind is dominated by fear. But the preparation wasn't just material, it was also emotional. I spent days forcing myself to practice calm in dark environments. I walked deserted streets at night, turned off the lights at home, and remained silent, simply listening to the sounds around me. I wanted to condition my mind not to panic in the face of what I couldn't see. Fear, I knew, wouldn't disappear, but it could be controlled. This mental training was perhaps the most important part of the preparation, because in the cemetery, it wouldn't be hunger or cold that would make me give up, but the constant battle against my thoughts. And then there was the dog. He wasn't just company. He was an essential part of the plan. A war dog is trained for extreme situations, to react quickly, to protect, but also to alert. I knew his instincts would be sharper than mine, that he would hear before me, sense before me, and perhaps even see what my human eyes couldn't. I spent days training him, reinforcing commands, testing his obedience in stressful environments. I needed to trust that when the time came, he would react correctly. The preparation also affected my body. At 70, I can't deny that the wear and tear is there. My joints ache, my breathing isn't as steady, and my stamina isn't the same as when I was 30. But I learned to respect my limits and work within them. I walked long distances every day, strengthened my muscles with simple exercises, and adjusted my diet to maintain sufficient energy. Every detail counted, because surviving the fear wasn't enough. I also had to physically survive the 12 or 24 hours I would spend inside that place. There was a moment when I wondered if I should warn anyone, if I should tell friends or family what I was about to do. But I soon realized that would be a mistake. People wouldn't understand. They would call it crazy, try to stop me, and maybe even succeed. This was a challenge that needed to be faced in silence, almost like a personal pact. Only the puppy and I knew what was about to happen, and in a way, that made the decision even heavier. The night before entering the cemetery was a sleepless night. I lay in bed and closed my eyes, but my mind wouldn't stop. I imagined scenarios, calculated possibilities, mentally listened to sounds I might hear inside. And above all, I thought about why I was doing this. It wasn't just about courage or stubbornness. It was about proving that there was still fire within me, that age hadn't defeated me. It was about facing the fears that had haunted me since my youth, but which I had always avoided facing head-on. Death had always been present in my life, on battlefields, on violent streets, in the memories of friends who had passed away. Entering an abandoned cemetery was, in part, a way of communicating with it, of telling it that I wasn't yet ready. On the appointed day, I calmly packed my backpack. I organized each item so I could easily find it in the dark. I adjusted the dog's collar, tested the flashlight again, and took a deep breath. I looked around the simple house where I live and realized that perhaps this might be the last time I saw those walls. Not because I truly believed I would die in the cemetery, but because every experience like this transforms. When you return, you never return the same. The drive to the place was silent. I drove to a nearby street and walked the rest, avoiding attention. The sun was low, painting the sky orange and red. Every step echoed on the ancient stone streets, as if the city were reminding me of its own history. As I approached the rusty gate, my heart raced. The dog stopped, looked at me, and then back inside, as if asking if I was really sure of what I was doing. And I was. Before entering, I took a deep breath and mentally reviewed the entire preparation process. I was ready. I had the equipment, the training, the focus, but I knew none of it would be enough if my mind gave in. It was the balance between body, mind, and instinct that would determine the outcome of that night. And so, when the sun finally set behind the trees, I pushed open the gate and entered the cemetery. The preparation was over. Now, the real test began. The gate creaked loudly as I pushed it open, as if resisting my entry, as if it were the final warning for me to turn back. The rust crumbled into orange dust under my hands, and the harsh sound echoed among the dry trees surrounding the cemetery. The dog standing firm beside me cast a watchful eye inside, his muscles tense as if ready to react. For a moment, I hesitated. I was standing before the line that separated the world of the living from the territory where death rests, and the sensation was of crossing an invisible threshold, a point of no return. I took a deep breath, adjusted the flashlight on my backpack, and took the first step inside. The first few hours at the cemetery were a plunge into absolute silence, interrupted only by the sounds of nature that endured in that forgotten space. Dusk painted the sky in purple and gold hues, and the last light of day cast long shadows on the broken tombstones. I walked slowly, taking in every detail. Many crosses were toppled. Some headstones no longer bore legible names, and others had deep cracks, as if time had taken it upon itself to erase their history. There were also ancient mausoleums with half-open iron doors and loose stones, which seemed to invite the wind to produce sounds similar to whispers. The dog sniffed the ground, sniffed the air, stared intently at specific points, as if something caught his attention. I knew there was nothing ordinary about this behavior. A dog trained in wartime doesn't waste energy on distractions. If he focused on something, it was because there was a reason, and this only increased the pressure in my chest. Each low growl was like a warning that I wasn't completely alone. With the sun nearly setting, I chose a central spot to set up my makeshift camp. There was no tent, no luxuries, just a heavy-duty sleeping bag, a small tarp to shield me from the damp ground, and my backpack with supplies. I positioned my flashlight within reach and double-checked the knife attached to my belt. The dog lay nearby, his ears pricked, alert for any movement. With each snap of a twig, he lifted his head, his eyes fixed on the darkness. As I organized my things, I looked around, letting my mind wander with inevitable questions. Who were the people buried there? What stories did they carry? Did their families still exist? Or had they been lost to time, like the names engraved on the stones? It was impossible not to feel the weight of centuries condensed in that space. Each grave was a reminder that life is fleeting, and there, more than anywhere else, I felt that time spares no one. As night fell, the cold began to intensify. The wind blew through the trees and the shadows grew denser. I turned on my flashlight, and the beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing only fragments of the surroundings, while everything else remained hidden. And that's precisely what the human mind can't stand: the unknown. What's beyond our reach of vision becomes drawn by the imagination, and not always logically. I walked a bit to explore the area. The dog followed me closely, alert, sniffing constantly. As I passed a mausoleum with its door ajar, the air felt colder than anywhere else in the cemetery. I shone my flashlight inside and saw only dust, cobwebs, and loose stones, but I felt as if something was watching. The dog stopped at the entrance, growled softly, and refused to advance. I decided to respect its instincts and kept walking. The first few hours became a game of staying calm and resisting the psychological pressure. Every shadow seemed to move. Every sound seemed charged with intention. The creaking of a tree in the wind sounded like footsteps. The hooting of a crow seemed like a distant cry. I knew my greatest challenge wouldn't be physical, but mental. The mind is capable of creating invisible enemies far more terrifying than any real beast. I sat down beside the camp and forced myself to take a deep breath. I remembered the training of the past few days, the importance of keeping my mind focused. I mentally told myself that none of that could make me give up, but it was difficult, because even with all the logic, the atmosphere of that place seemed to have a life of its own. There was something about cemeteries that goes beyond explanation. It was as if the space held energy, as if the emotions of generations were there, permeated in the air. The dog approached me, lay down beside me, and kept his eyes fixed on a point ahead. I followed his gaze, but there was nothing visible, only the dense darkness between the trees. This behavior repeated itself several times. I knew I needed to trust his instincts, but each time it happened, my heart raced, and I found myself fighting the urge to believe something invisible was there. As the hours passed, the moon rose high and bright, illuminating part of the cemetery. The silvery light made the surroundings even more eerie. The shadows of the crosses stretched across the ground like outstretched arms, and the mausoleums looked like ruined towers from a forgotten city. The contrast between darkness and light created illusions that tested my sanity. Sometimes I thought I saw rapid movements, figures that disappeared when I stared intently. I knew it was my mind playing tricks, but that didn't make the experience any less frightening. To try to distract himself, I decided to drink some water and eat one of the energy bars. The cold was starting to bite into my skin, and every muscle felt stiffer. The dog, on the other hand, remained restless. At one point he stood up abruptly, barked into the darkness, and took a few steps forward, as if to protect his territory. I called him back and he obeyed, but he didn't take his eyes off the direction he had run. This was the first clear sign that the night would not be peaceful. The first few hours inside the cemetery became a silent battle between me and the place. There were moments when I managed to convince myself that everything was under control, that the only real danger was the cold or some animal that might appear. But all it took was a strange sound, a movement from the dog, or even absolute silence for the fear to return with a vengeance. It was as if the cemetery were alive, testing my limits, probing how much I could endure before giving in. Time seemed to drag. Each minute felt like an eternity. I looked at the clock and couldn't believe that only an hour had passed. The clock became an enemy, because it showed how much longer it was until sunrise. And in that interval, anything could happen. With every breath, I told myself I was prepared, that I had trained for this. But the truth is, no amount of preparation could fully prepare me for the sensation of being in a place charged with so much mystery, surrounded by memories that didn't belong to me, but that seemed to whisper around me. Night finally fell completely, and with it came the inevitable transformation of the cemetery. What had seemed like ancient ruins and forgotten stones during the evening now became a landscape of living shadows. The moon, high in the sky, let out a pale light, just enough to create distorted silhouettes. With each cross that jutted out from the ground, my gaze wavered, as if expecting to find movement where there was none. A cold breeze blew across the open field, and the silence was so absolute that even the beating of my own heart felt like an intruder. I set up camp simply near a cluster of tilted gravestones. It wasn't the most comfortable spot, but it gave me a clear view of the surrounding area, which was essential. I spread the tarp over the damp ground and organized my small survival area. My sleeping bag was in the center, my flashlight within reach of my right hand, and my knife was clipped to my belt. My water bottle and energy bars were stored inside my backpack, which I kept closed to avoid any distractions. The dog lay down beside me, but his posture wasn't one of rest. He remained alert, his body rigid, his ears erect, and his eyes fixed on every corner of the room. A war dog never completely relaxes, but that night something was different. He kept sniffing the air, and every now and then he let out a low growl, almost imperceptible, but enough to make my skin crawl. I knew he was sensing something I couldn't see. The first decision I made was to explore the site a little more before giving in to time. I turned on the flashlight and walked slowly among the tombstones, while the dog followed close behind, his eyes shining in the reflected light. The beam illuminated details that would otherwise go unnoticed in daylight. On some old tombstones, the lettering was worn away, but forgotten names from the 19th century could still be read. There were strange symbols engraved on some stones, markings that were not part of the usual pattern. Perhaps they were just ancient ornaments, but in that context, They seemed to carry hidden meanings. I passed an iron mausoleum, its door ajar. The air coming out was colder than the rest of the cemetery, and the flashlight barely penetrated the darkness. The puppy stopped suddenly, growled, and took 2 steps back. That was enough to stop me from going in. I decided to keep walking, but I couldn't ignore the feeling that something was watching me from inside the building. Upon returning to camp, I noticed the wind picking up. The trees swayed, making sounds like wailing. I sat in my sleeping bag and watched the sky. The stars shone, but the cemetery seemed isolated from the rest of the world, as if it were a separate territory, where time passed at a different pace. This realization was reinforced every time I glanced at my watch and saw that only a few minutes had passed, when I swore I'd been there for hours. I decided to eat something to keep my energy up. I pulled one of the energy bars from my backpack and chewed slowly. The taste was dry, but the act of chewing helped keep my mind occupied. The dog remained lying down, but his eyes never stopped scanning every corner of the darkness. With every movement of the wind, he would lift his head and watch intently. I knew that if he reacted more intensely, it would mean something was really happening. It was at that moment that I realized how nighttime in a cemetery isn't just an absence of light. It's an entity of its own, with presence, weight, and breath. The air seemed denser, and every sound, no matter how small, took on immense proportions. A twig falling to the ground sounded like an explosion. The caw of a distant crow sounded like the echo of a human scream. The mind, under pressure, magnifies every detail, and I struggled not to give in to these illusions. After a while, I decided to walk again, this time more cautiously. I wanted to observe the dog's behavior, and it was he who alerted me first. He stopped suddenly, straightening up, and stared intently at an area to the left of the cemetery. I shone my flashlight in that direction, but saw nothing but trees and shadows. Still, the dog stood his ground, growling softly, as if something were lurking. I remained still, listening only to the sound of the wind. After a few seconds, he relaxed, but his eyes remained fixed. The feeling of not being alone began to weigh more heavily with each passing minute. It was as if the cemetery itself were watching me, as if the headstones were eyes focused on me. I tried to push these thoughts away, remembering the mental preparation I had made in the previous days. I took a deep breath and returned to camp, determined to remain calm. But it was impossible to ignore the constant unease growing within me. As the night wore on, the cold intensified. I adjusted my jacket and curled up in my sleeping bag, but I couldn't relax. Every time I closed my eyes, images flashed through my mind. Nameless faces, shadows walking, figures moving behind tombstones. I opened my eyes repeatedly, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. And indeed, it was. But in the environment I was in, even my imagination seemed to come to life. The dog suddenly stood up, his fur standing on end. He barked twice, loudly, toward a dark spot. I quickly grabbed the flashlight and shone it on the spot. Once again, there was nothing. No visible movement, no sign of an intruder. Just silence. Yet, his behavior said otherwise. He remained standing for a few minutes before lying down again, still alert. That was the moment I knew, clearly, that I couldn't let my guard down for a moment. The night wore on slowly, dragging on as if it took pleasure in prolonging my discomfort. The clock showed just over 10 o'clock, and I already felt as if I'd passed an eternity. The puppy slept for brief moments, but woke easily, always reacting to sounds I barely noticed. The cold, darkness, and heavy atmosphere made every minute a psychological challenge. There were times when I thought about giving up. The idea of walking through the gate and returning home seduced me, but each time it crossed my mind, I remembered why I was there. It wasn't just a physical challenge, it was a test of my ability to face the invisible, to resist my deepest fear. Giving up would mean admitting that age had won, that I no longer had the strength to face my own ghosts, and I wasn't willing to accept that. I decided then that the best way to face the onset of night was to transform fear into observation. Instead of running from sounds, I decided to listen to them. Instead of avoiding shadows, I began to face them. I walked slowly, flashlight in hand, and observed every detail around me. I discovered that the wind created sound illusions as it passed through the trees, that crows moved among the branches and produced strange sounds, that the silence was not complete, but filled with small noises that the mind amplified. This realization brought me some control, but only for a moment, because then the dog barked again, and this time ran a few steps toward the back of the cemetery, as if something were really there. I ran to him, grabbed his leash, and shone my flashlight on him. Once again, nothing. Just darkness, trees, and moss-covered rocks. But the dog didn't seem convinced. He continued to stare, breathing heavily, as if certain something was up. That was the point I realized that no matter how prepared I was, the night inside that cemetery would be unpredictable. The beginning of the night was like this: a duel between reason and instinct, between what my eyes saw and what the dog seemed to sense. With each passing minute, the atmosphere grew heavier, as if the cemetery had a life of its own. And I knew this was just the beginning. Dawn had arrived, and with it, the absolute silence grew heavier. The early evening had already been a test for my mind, but now I could feel, almost physically, that something was changing in that place. The cold seemed more intense, not just on my body, but in the atmosphere. It was as if the air were denser, more charged, and each breath required more effort. The dog, who until then had alternated between alert and restful, was once again in a vigilant position, his body tense and his eyes fixed in directions I couldn't understand. It was shortly after midnight that the first signs of tension began to show more clearly. I was sitting on the top, holding the flashlight, when I heard a distant metallic sound, like chains dragging across the stone floor. At first, I thought it was just an illusion caused by the wind, but the cub reacted immediately, jumping to its feet and growling lowly. The sound repeated, this time closer, and I could feel goosebumps rising all over my skin. I pointed the flashlight in the direction of the noise, but there was nothing but moss-covered tombstones. Even so, the feeling that someone or something was moving about was undeniable. I decided to get up and walk slowly, accompanied by the dog. The flashlight beam moved in circles, illuminating broken crosses, fallen stones, and the uneven terrain. Each step was calculated, because I knew that in an environment like that, the slightest noise could seem like a scream. The dog advanced ahead, sniffing intensely, as if trying to find an invisible trail. The silence was broken again, not by the chains, but by the sound of footsteps light, as if someone were moving among the trees. My heart raced. It was impossible to ignore. The sound was there all around me. I took a deep breath, tried to remain calm, and kept walking. The dog stopped suddenly, its fur standing on end, and barked toward a dark corner of the cemetery. I pointed the flashlight firmly, but there was nothing. The beam trembled slightly in my hands, not because the flashlight was weak, but because adrenaline was coursing through my entire body. I remained still for a few seconds, listening for any movement. Silence returned, but the dog didn't relax. I returned to camp and sat down again. this time with the knife in hand. I knew there might be nothing physical there, but the human instinct to protect oneself speaks louder in these moments. The cub lay down, but his body was tense, as if ready to spring at any moment. The night was advancing, and the cemetery seemed more alive than ever. It was then that something strange happened. I had turned off the flashlight to save battery, and was observing only by moonlight when I noticed a subtle movement in the background. It wasn't an animal, nor was it shaped like anything familiar. It was just a shadow that seemed to move between the tombstones. I blinked, trying to make sure it wasn't just an illusion caused by the moon's reflection. But the dog confirmed my suspicions. He suddenly stood up and began growling, walking slowly toward the shadow. I held onto its collar and stood still, watching. The shadow seemed to disappear and reappear in different spots, always at the edge of my vision. It was as if it were toying with my mind, testing my endurance. Cold sweat ran down my face, even in the early morning chill. I refused to believe there was anything supernatural there, but my mind no longer had the same control it once had. The hours spent in the silence of the cemetery were beginning to erode my defenses. Shortly after, another sound could be heard, this time behind me. I turned sharply and shined my flashlight, but nothing was there. The puppy spun around quickly, barking loudly, as if something had moved. The tension reached an unbearable level. I felt as if I was surrounded, not by people or animals, but by an invisible presence, one that delighted in keeping me alert. I sat back down and closed my eyes for a few seconds, trying to regain control. I took a deep breath, remembering why I was there. I wasn't just seeking physical survival, but proving to myself that I could still resist my deepest fear. The dog lay down beside me, but didn't relax. I could feel his heavy, accelerated breathing, and it only reinforced my own sense of threat. Time seemed to stand still. I glanced at my watch and saw that sunrise was still 4 hours away. 4 endless hours, where any sound could be a harbinger of something bigger. I knew I needed to remain calm, but every minute became more difficult. Just then, the wind blew hard, causing the trees to move violently. Dry leaves dragged along the ground, making a sound reminiscent of rapid footsteps. The dog barked loudly and ran toward the movement, straining against the leash. I held him firmly, but his strength was impressive. I shined my flashlight and saw only flying leaves, but the feeling of pursuit was inevitable. I decided not to resist the dog's instinct. I loosened the leash and let him take a few steps forward. He ran toward a group of gravestones and began digging furiously in the ground. My heart raced. What was he trying to find? I approached slowly and shone a light on the spot. The earth was loose, as if it had been recently disturbed. The sight left me stunned. It was impossible not to think that something had been buried there, and perhaps it shouldn't be disturbed. I grabbed the dog and pulled him back, even against his resistance. This was one of the most tense moments of the night. I felt as if, as he dug, he was about to reveal something that should have remained hidden. We returned to camp, but the atmosphere had changed completely. The air felt heavier, the cold more intense, and the silence more suffocating. It was as if the cemetery had reacted to what had happened, as if the mere attempt to find out had provoked a response. I no longer knew if I would have the strength to resist until dawn. The cemetery seemed to want to expel me, and every fiber of my being screamed to get out. Still, I remained. I gripped the flashlight tightly, the knife in my other hand, and kept my eyes fixed on the darkness. The dog beside me was breathing heavily, alert, ready for action. The tense moments were relentless, and I knew the night still had more to offer. The dawn crept slowly, as if time had become an invisible enemy. Each minute seemed to drag by, and the clock seemed to mock me, showing me that dawn was still hours away. My body was beginning to complain. My legs were stiff, my shoulders ached from the weight of tension, and the cold seeped into my bones, making every movement more difficult. I knew that, at that moment, the true test of endurance was just beginning. It wasn't just physical. My body ached, true, but my mind was the most challenging battlefield. The darkness left no room for distractions, and the silence echoed my own thoughts deafeningly. It was as if the cemetery, with its charged atmosphere, was forcing me to look within myself. Memories surfaced forcefully, memories I had buried over the years. I saw friends who had fallen in combat. I saw my father teaching me discipline. I saw death up close so many times that, sitting there on the damp ground, I felt like I was conversing with it again. The cub beside me remained steadfast. His body was tense, but his rhythmic breathing reminded me I wasn't alone. Every now and then, he would get up, walk in circles, sniff the air, and then lie down again. His presence was both a relief and a reminder that danger still lurked. It was as if his instincts were the lifeline that kept me awake, alert, and aware that I couldn't falter. The cold, however, was a relentless enemy. With each hour, the temperature seemed to drop further. My hands trembled even in my pockets, and my breath came in white clouds in the flashlight's light. I tried to move to generate heat, but the effort drained my energy. Eating an energy bar brought me some relief, but it was fleeting. My body demanded rest, but my mind wouldn't allow it. Every time I closed my eyes, images appeared as if they were real. Whispers, shadows, figures that approached and disappeared. I opened my eyes immediately, gasping, and found only the silent cemetery. Mental resilience was undoubtedly the greatest challenge. Fear is a force that infiltrates every thought, and there, surrounded by tombstones and shadows, it seemed to take on a form of its own. I had to fight the urge to believe everything I saw or heard. I had to separate reality from illusion, instinct from desperation. This struggle was exhausting. There was no pause, no respite. It was a constant battle against myself. The dog suddenly stood up and ran a few steps towards the shadow cast by a tree. He barked loudly, and his bark echoed throughout the cemetery. I ran to him, grabbed his leash, and shined a light on the area. Once again, nothing. But his body didn't lie. He was convinced something was there. I walked him back to camp and realized how adrenaline had sapped the last of my strength. I sat down on my sleeping bag and took a deep breath, trying to calm my heart, which was pounding like a drum. That was the point at which I understood that the test of endurance wasn't just physical or psychological. It was also spiritual, because in the silence of the cemetery, I found myself faced with questions I never wanted to answer. What does courage truly mean? Is it facing visible enemies, or facing the ghosts that dwell within us? What does it mean to grow old?